Todd, you and I talk quite a bit about the need for executive protection and consulting in our industry. And unfortunately, here lately, we've been talking even more about executive protection and the things that are going on that we're seeing day in and day out. That need is really increasing. But, we also talk a lot about when people hear the words executive protection, they often think of bodyguards and motorcades and the kind of things that we see in TV and movies. But your perspective as a former Secret Service agent and your time in corporate security, what does executive protection really involve today?
Yeah, I mean, Eddie, I think you're spot on. And, the public's perception of executive protection is commonly the Secret Service's presidential detail. Um, so, I mean, in reality, that's what everybody sees on a daily basis. But, protecting the life of is the primary objective of executive protection. But there's numerous other reasons we do it and why we use these services, especially in the private sector. This includes things like business continuity for a company, reputation and brand protection, productivity and efficiency, legal and liability reasons, privacy concerns. So there's numerous other reasons other than the core mission of protecting a life that we do executive protection in the private sector. And the reality is that very few VIPs have unlimited resources for
Yeah.
these physical and technical assets that are required to mitigate these risks. So especially from my experience in corporate security, it was a big adjustment coming from the Secret Service. But you need to look at executive protection both holistically and individually, based on the risk for the protectee, as well as balancing these with the resources that are available. And in most cases, it's very limited resources.
Yeah, and you raise a good point. That certainly there's not unlimited budgets, regardless of what the industry or the entity is, and so that really gets down to a principle in private security around those risk assessments. And you mentioned that it has to be individualized to the person's situation and all different kind of factors. But when you think about the risk landscape today, what threats or risk are executives and these high-profile individuals, what are they facing right now, and how has that evolved over just the past 3 or 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start out by saying, I mean, today's risk environment is much more complex than when I started my career, and I won't say the date just to give away my age. But no, executive protection requires, as I said, that holistic approach due to this today's risk environment. We still have, as we've seen, unfortunately, very recently, we have the lone wolf assassination attempts.
Yeah.
We have domestic and international terrorist threats. But now we have extremist groups and hostile protesters. We have increased travel risk due to the geopolitical tensions. And, as we know, I mean, corporate America travels internationally quite frequently. So that's a big concern. I mean, I recognize that in my previous role. Um, we have constant cyber and digital risks, and then there's just ever emerging technology that can be used against us. And I mean, I don't think we'll have time today to get into AI. I'm
Sure.
a big believer in AI, but it also brings risk with it, right? So the list of potential threats just continues to grow.
Yeah, and you mentioned that executive protection is a lot about managing those risks. And one of the things that you and I have talked a lot about here in the last few months and working on a few projects, and that's really educated me, is how much value there is in that risk management and going through some of those steps, things like travel risk and threat intelligence. And I know even in my international travels, and I'm far from a high profile individual or someone who would ordinarily be in need of any type of executive protection, but that's been valuable to me, just some of those tools that I didn't know were available, just where to go, where not to go. So walk us through a little bit of those key components, things like risk assessments, travel security, and intelligence. How does that go into a successful executive protection program?
Yeah, and we started out by saying, everybody looks at executive protection, the bodyguard piece of it. But really, risk assessments, in my opinion, are the foundation to identify the risk and determine what resources are needed to effectively mitigate those risks. And yes, in some cases, that will be the executive protection agent, the bodyguard. But it goes back to starting with these core security functions. Risk assessment, it's at your protectee's residence, their place of work, and locations they visit frequently. And then, when you start talking about going outside of those places, when they're going to a public event, conducting a security in advance of their arrival, or doing a travel risk assessment prior to the VIP traveling, whether it's, domestically to one of our cities, because all of, as we see, bad things happen anywhere, and then especially internationally. So I think that that risk assessment is such a critical piece of executive protection, and you're doing this in advance of anything happening.
Yeah.
And then in today's world, another thing I think is just very crucial is the constant monitoring of social media platforms and the dark web. There's potential threats that exist, on those platforms all the time. And if you're monitoring it, you have the opportunity maybe to identify some of those risks before they're, in front of you. And then we mentioned also the digital cybersecurity threats.
Yeah.
They also need to be addressed as part of an executive protection security plan. They're not so traditional. They take a little more expertise, but certainly the resources are there to address those risks also.
Yeah, and we also talk a lot about right sizing, the security plan, whether we're talking about physical security, executive protection, or all manner of protection in general. And when it comes to EP, I know you and I have talked a lot about the value of really making sure that someone is designing the program that they need based on their risk level and their situation. And one of the things that happens when high profile events unfortunately occur is you have a lot of people that are reaching out for these types of services, and rightfully so. They're very valuable services, but what role does security consulting really play in this? Because, for example, DSI Security Services, one of the reasons that we're partnering up with Buckhorn and yourself is to make sure that we have cutting edge expertise. So we're not just responding in a very cookie cutter way, that we're actually making sure that that's right sized to the individual and the environment. So, how important is it to have a really seasoned security consultant guiding you in this process?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that was a really big adjustment coming from the Secret Service to corporate security because the resources were maybe not all the resources you wanted, but you had adequate resources in my role in the Secret Service. Corporate security, I got there and I realized I didn't really have any resources dedicated to executive protection or event security. So, knowing you don't have the internal resources available, you have to take a different approach. As I mentioned before, the first step I think is to do a thorough risk assessment and really determine the necessary resources to mitigate any risk you identify. In most cases, these resources aren't even needed on a full-time basis. And, I think your first thought is, I need to have, executive protection agents or an intelligence analyst on my team. But when you really look at it realistically, maybe you don't require internal full-time employees to do that. Very expensive to a company. Um, to your question, what can a consultant do for you? A qualified consultant can assist with conducting the risk assessments, helping you to prioritize your risk, identifying the resources necessary to address those risks, and then really present that to, well, not just to you, but to that executive team who you have to convince, right?
Yeah.
So they're going to help you provide your business case, maybe with a cost comparison of FTEs versus external consultants on an as-need basis. Um, a consultant will help you focus on your most critical needs. And then I think really important too is have that professional network to identify,
Yeah.
the qualified contract security personnel and resources that you deem appropriate.
Yeah,
Um,
and to that point too, Todd, we talk a lot about customization, but it's important to have somebody with the experience and the knowledge of how to construct these programs, because it is a different animal than a normal physical security. And part of that is, in the wake of some of these recent tragedies, there has been a lot of emphasis placed on, the personnel aspect of EP, which is very important. But talk a little bit about, what does technology bring to the table here? We're talking about that a lot in the physical security space as a whole, but how does technology impact executive protection and even consulting services?
yeah, I think we started talking about this. I mean, the operational security intelligence, I believe, is critical to an effective executive protection security plan. You need to be constantly, monitoring potential threats and analyzing these threats. Um, Again, this is an area where if you don't have internal, intelligence analysts on your team, you have to find a way to gather this information. This collected by various methods. It can be open source, social media monitoring, law enforcement, or just local contacts. But, in many of these horrific news reports we've seen recently, there's later there it's identified there were red flags flying on social media posts prior to the incident, and through constant social media monitoring or the dark web, you potentially can identify these risks or be aware of these risks and make decisions prior to maybe attending an event or bringing this to attention of law enforcement to take any action they deem appropriate. So, I think this piece of it is critical and probably is not done as effectively or as commonly as we should be.
Yeah. And also I've asked you this question before because recently we've gotten calls from existing customers and other colleagues and people in the industry and outside of the industry that never really thought about executive protection before. Again, I mentioned, even myself, I thought, well, I will never have a need for anything like this just because of the position that I hold. But if you could give a piece of advice or one takeaway to somebody that's exploring this for the first time, or they want to really enhance their program, because again, we've got a lot of calls like, hey, we've never thought about this before for our CEO. He or she is not a high profile person, or it may be somebody else in the organization, but now we have to think about it. What would be one practical takeaway or advice you would give somebody that's really jumping into this for the first time?
Yeah, I'm going to speak at this from my role in corporate security. I'm not saying I struggled from day one, but you walk into the environment, you start doing your risk assessments and what can I do to make things better? And, I decided very early on that what I really need to do is create a culture of security awareness within the company.
Yeah,
We in today's world, we can't live by that old adage, it'll never happen to us or to me. But also, when you're in a corporate security environment, you also know you don't have unlimited budget or resources.
yeah,
So that doesn't mean you have to spend millions of dollars on executive protection or completely change the way you do business. But you do need to create that culture of security awareness and make the security part of the security team part of the business. Um, you know, it doesn't happen overnight, but things you can do is, you can do training for the employees. You can do regular briefings to the executive teams. Um, and in time, you're going to be expected to be involved in all these things we just talked about: travel
yeah,
security, risk assessments, executive protection, business continuity planning, crisis management trainings. In time, the goal is to become a trusted business partner, be part of the business. So again, it doesn't happen overnight, but that would be what I would tell somebody is, just just try to incorporate this corporate security team into the business and become that trusted business partner. If you if you wait until a crisis or a major incident to get to know your business partners, it's too late, right? So,
yeah, yeah,
I mean, if you don't know where to start, I mean, I was just hiring a qualified consultant who has
sure.
corporate security experience because I think it's a common challenge for all of us in that field.
Yeah. And again, this is such a specialized area. That's why it's important to sometimes cut through all the different things that are out there and really finding out what is the best method, what is the best prevention plan for my organization. And, you said it well, these things should be handled well in advance of something happening. Hopefully, nothing ever does happen, but we've seen in our world that that's not always what we find. So, having those conversations early as possible. And what we've seen in the wake of some of these tragedies are people are starting to have those conversations for the first time, and that's great as well. That prompts us to really look at these things. And it's like the old
Yeah.
saying: the best time is yesterday, the second best time is today to start looking at those things. So, Todd, I'm sure we'll continue this conversation. Thanks so much for the great
Yep.
advice and perspective.
Thank you, Eddie.